And today I will be reading from Elizabeth von Arnim's novel VERA, chapter 1 of which starts out, "When the doctor had gone and the two women from the village he had been waiting for were upstairs shut in with her dead father, Lucy went out into the garden and stood leaning on the gate, staring at the sea." And she does that throughout chapter 1 until Weems, a stranger whose wife has died a week before, rather barges his way into the garden to speak to her. And this is chapter 2. There was a seat under a mulberry tree on the little lawn with its back to the house and the gaping windows, and Weems, spying it out, led Lucy to it as if she were a child, holding her by the hand. She went with him indifferently. What did it matter whether she sat under the mulberry tree or stood at the gate? This convulsed stranger, was he real? Was anything real? Let him tell her whatever it was he wanted to tell her, and she would listen and get him his glass of water, and then he would go his way, and by the time the women would have finished upstairs and she could be with her father again. "I'll fetch the water," she said when they got to the seat. "No, sit down," said Weems. She sat down. So did he, letting her hand go. It dropped on the seat, palm upwards between them. "It's strange our coming across each other like this," he said, looking at her while she looked indifferently straight in front of her at the sun on the grass beyond the shade of the mulberry tree, at a mass of huge fuchsia bushes a little way off. "I've been going through hell, and so must you have been. Good God, what hell! Do you mind if I tell you? You'll understand because of your own..." Lucy didn't mind. She didn't mind anything. She merely vaguely wondered that he should think she had been going through hell. Hell and her darling father. How quaint it sounded. She began to suspect that she was asleep. All this wasn't really happening. Her father wasn't dead. Presently the housemaid would come in with the hot water and wake her to the usual cheerful day. The man sitting beside her, he seemed rather vivid for a dream, it was true, so detailed, with his flushed face and the perspiration on his forehead. Besides, the feel of his big warm hand a moment ago and the small puffs of heat that came from his clothes when he moved. But it was so unlikely. Everything that had happened since breakfast was so unlikely. This man too would resolve himself soon into just something she had had for dinner last night, and she would tell her father about her dream at breakfast and they would laugh. She stirred uneasily. It wasn't a dream. It was real. "The story is unbelievably horrible," Weems was saying in a high aggrievement, looking at her little head with the straight-cut hair and her grave profile. How old was she? 18? 28? Impossible to tell exactly with hair cut like that, but young anyhow compared to him. Very young perhaps compared to him who was well over 40, and so much scarred, so deeply scarred by this terrible thing that had happened to him. "It's so horrible that I wouldn't talk about it if you were going to mind," he went on. "But you can't mind because you're a stranger, and it may help you with your own trouble, because whatever you may suffer, I'm suffering much worse, so then you'll see yours isn't so bad. And besides, I must talk to someone. I shall go mad." This was certainly a dream, thought Lucy. Things didn't happen like this when one was awake. Grotesque things. She turned her head and looked at him. No, it wasn't a dream. No dream could be so solid as the man beside her. What was he saying? He was saying in a tormented voice that he was Weems. "You are Weems," she repeated gravely. It made no impression on her. She didn't mind his being Weems. "I'm the Weems the newspapers were full of last week," he said, seeing that the name left her unmoved. "My God," he went on again, wiping his forehead, but as fast as he wiped it, more beads burst out. "Those posters. To see one's own name staring at one everywhere on posters." "Why was your name on posters?" said Lucy. She didn't want to know. She asked mechanically, her ear attentive only to the sounds from the open windows of the room upstairs. "Don't you read newspapers here?" "I don't think we do," she said, listening. "We've been settling in. I don't think we've remembered to order any newspapers yet." A look of some, at any rate, relief from the pressure he was evidently struggling under came into Weems's face. "Then I can tell you the real version," he said, "without your being already filled up with the monstrous suggestions that were made at the inquest, as though I hadn't suffered enough as it was, as though it hadn't been terrible enough already." "The inquest?" repeated Lucy. Again she turned her head and looked at him. "Has your trouble anything to do with death?" "Why, you don't suppose anything else would reduce me to the state I'm in?" "Oh, I'm sorry," she said, and into her eyes and into her voice came a different expression. Something living, something gentle. "I hope it wasn't anybody you loved." "It was my wife," said Weems. He got up quickly. So near was he to crying at the thought of it, at the thought of all he had endured, and turned his back on her and began stripping the leaves off the branches above his head. Lucy watched him, leaning forward a little on both hands. "Tell me about it," she said presently, very gently. He came back and dropped down heavily beside her again, and with many interjections of astonishment that such a ghastly calamity could ever have happened to him who till now had never... "Yes," said Lucy comprehendingly and gravely. "Yes, I know. Had never had anything to do with, well, with calamities." He told her the story. They had gone down, he and his wife, as they did every 25th of July for the summer, to their house on the river. And he had been looking forward to a glorious time of peaceful doing nothing after months of London, just lying about in a punt and reading and smoking and resting. London was an awful place for tiring one out. And if they hadn't been there 24 hours before his wife, the remembrance of it was too grievous to him. He couldn't go on. "Was she very ill?" asked Lucy gently, to give him time to recover. "I think that would almost be better. One would be a little prepared." "She wasn't ill at all," cried Weems. "She just died." "Oh, like father," exclaimed Lucy, roused now altogether. It was she now who laid her hand on his. Weems seized it between both his and went on quickly. "He was writing letters," he said, "in the library, at his table in the window where he could see the terrace and the garden and the river. They had had tea together only an hour before. There was a flagged terrace along that side of the house, the side the library was on and all the principal rooms, and all of a sudden there was a great flash of shadow between him and the light, come and gone instantaneously, and instantaneously then there was a thud. He would never forget it, that thud, and there outside his window on the flags..." Don't, gasped Lucy. "It was my wife," Weems hurried on, not able now to stop, looking at Lucy while he talked with eyes of amazed horror. "Fallen out of the top room of the house, her sitting room, because of the view. It was in a straight line with the library window. She dropped past my window like a stone. She was smashed. Oh, don't. Now can you wonder at the state I'm in?" he cried. "Can you wonder if I'm nearly off my head? And forced to be by myself, forced into retirement for what the world considers a proper period of mourning, with nothing to think of but that ghastly inquest." He hurt her hand, he gripped it so hard. "If you hadn't let me to come and talk to you, I believe I'd have pitched myself over the cliff there this afternoon and made an end of it." "But how? But why? How could she fall?" whispered Lucy, to whom poor Weems's misfortune seemed more frightful than anything she had ever heard of. She hung on his words, her eyes on his face, her lips parted, her whole body an agony of sympathy. Life, how terrible it was and how unsuspected. One went on and on, never dreaming of the sudden dreadful day when the coverings were going to be dropped and one would see it was death after all, that it had been death all the time, death pretending, death waiting. Her father, so full of love and interests and plans, gone, finished, brushed away as if he no more mattered than some insect one unseeingly treads on as one walks. And this man's wife, dead in an instant, dead so far more cruelly, so horribly. I had often told her to be careful of that window, Weems answered in a voice that almost sounded like anger. But all the time his tone had been one of high anger at the wanton, outrageous cruelty of fate. It was a very low one, and the floor was slippery, oak. Every floor in my house is polished oak. I had them put in myself. She must have been leaning out and her feet slipped away behind her. That would make her fall head foremost. Oh, oh, said Lucy, shrinking. What could she do? What could she say to help him, to soften at last these dreadful memories? And then, Weems went on after a moment, as unaware as Lucy was that she was tremblingly stroking his hand. At the inquest, as though it hadn't all been awful enough for me already, the jury must actually get wrangling about the cause of her death. The cause of death? Echoed Lucy, but she fell. Whether it were an accident or done on purpose. Done on suicide. Oh. She drew in her breath quickly. But it wasn't? How could it be? She was my wife. Without a care in the world, everything done for her, no troubles, nothing on her mind, nothing wrong with her health. We'd been married 15 years and I was devoted to her, devoted to her. He banged his knee with his free hand. His voice was full of indignant tears. Then why did the jury? My wife had a fool of a maid. I never could stand that woman, and it was something she said at the inquest, some invention or other about what my wife had said to her. You know what servants are. It upsets some of the jury. You know, juries are made up of anybody and everybody. Butchers, bakers and candlestick makers. Quite uneducated, most of them. Quite at the mercy of any suggestion. And so instead of a verdict of death by misadventure, which would have been the right one, it was an open verdict. Oh, how terrible. How terrible for you, breathed Lucy, her eyes on his, her mouth twitching with sympathy. You'd have seen all about it if you'd read the papers last week, said Weems. It had done him good to get it out and talked over. He looked down at her upturned face with its horror-stricken eyes and twitching mouth. Now tell me about yourself, he said with a touch of compunction. Nothing that had happened to her could be so horrible as what had happened to him. Still, she too was newly smitten. They had met on a common ground of disaster. Death himself had been their introducer. Is life all only death? She breathed, her horror-stricken eyes on his. Before he could answer, and what was there to answer to such a question, except that of course it wasn't, and he and she were just victims of a monstrous special unfairness. He certainly was. Her father probably died as fathers did, in the usual way, in his bed. But before he could answer, the two women came out of the house and with small discreet steps proceeded down the path to the gate. The sun flooded their spare figures and their decent black clothes kept for these occasions as a mark of respectful sympathy. And one of them saw Lucy under the mulberry tree and hesitated, and then came across the grass to her with the mincing steps of tact. Here's somebody coming to speak to you, said Weems, for Lucy was sitting with her back to the path. She started and looked around. The woman approached hesitatingly, her head on one side, her hands folded, her face pulled into a little smile intended to convey encouragement and pity. The gentleman's quite ready, miss, she said softly.